much more than merely human engineering. There was alien engineering involved by agreement with the United States government. And strangely enough, the government didn't spend a cent on this entire project, which was privately funded, as I explained this afternoon. Originally Nazi gold, and then further on, when they ran out of that, Krupp's the Krupp's family of Germany financed the balance through ITP Corporation because the project was a continuation of research begun by the Germans during World War II, and actually prior to World War II. So the project came online, and many strange things happened. First of all, let's back up a little bit and state that when the German scientists were kicked out of good old Brookhaven National Laboratories, they didn't have very far to go east, and they were welcomed in by the Army to continue their research. It was about 1968. About a year later, when they shut down the whole SAGE system, went to the BMUs up north, and then, of course, the Army and most of the military moved out, and the base was officially abandoned. At that point, the scientists were already there. They weren't moving. They stayed on the base. Some kind of a covert agreement reached. Who was all involved, I don't know. But when the earlier phases of the investigation started as to what had been going on out there, and this, of course, I'm talking about 1985 and 86, when Senator Goldwater got into the act, one of the first things he ran into was the fact they could find no oversight committees that had any jurisdiction. They could find no references. They could find no funding, no expenditures, and with no expenditures of government money, there's no accountability. Consequently, nobody knew anything about it in the House, or the Senate, or the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or the Secretaries of the Army, Navy, the Air Force. They all professed ignorance. Well, this went on for a while, and finally, my friend, who was a nephew of the Senator, checked and asked an old friend of his, Bill Casey, then director of the CIA, this was late 85 and 86, do you know anything about a big project, a secret project at Montauk? I said, oh yeah. Well, what can you tell me about it? Nothing. But he did admit that there was such a project. And from that point on, a little bit more leaked. We finally realized it was an enormous project, and of course the intelligence community as a whole had oversight on it, and they knew exactly what was going on, and they were totally involved. Whatever that means, but they were involved, and they kept tabs on the whole thing. Now in 1963 approximately, when they began the theoretical work which led to the time tunnel work, there was an alien group involved called the Leverons. There's a simple spelling for that, and there's a more expanded spelling, but basically phonetically it's Leveron, the Leveron group. They were from the Orion Confederation, not reptilian, but part of that huge confederation, star system, various groups. They were here more or less by invite of the government and acceptance of the government, and they had a great deal of computer expertise, but their computers didn't match our IBM 360s, which was the best we had available at that time. And they were way ahead of it. They couldn't couple them together, so they had to transcribe by hand, literally, the information from their computers into ours. First by cord system, then later by magnetic tape. And after about 10 years, they had all the data transferred into the 360, and later on was replaced with the 370. And they then tried to make the system work about 1975 with computers only. Control the whole operation of the IBM 360 370. And they found, even with hard disk drives, with a lot of data storage and hard disks, they couldn't get the system to work very well, except occasionally. They knew they had problems, and of course, engineering-wise, they pursued this and eventually changed quite a bit the way the system functioned. Initially, they started out with almost unchanged. The SAGE system was inherited from the Air Force, and that involved a couple of 300 kW output stages, not the ampletrons. It was soon changed to the ampletron. In fact, the ampletron was developed by Raytheon Company in Goleta, California for this project, and for actually an earlier project which involved the BMU system. So the ampletron was quickly installed in there, But each one of those little packages cost over $1 million a piece. Do you have any idea how many the government ordered from Raytheon? We finally found out. Over 4,000. That's $1 million a piece. It's not exactly a small piece of change. Around $4 million plus. I'm sure it kept Raytheon in business for a long while. I'm sure it did not object to the business. The manufacturing was eventually transferred out of Goleta, which was strictly R&D and prototype production, into Weymouth, Massachusetts, one of the major operations of Raytheon, and they kept cranking those things out until we didn't want them anymore. Maybe some in surplus storage now, for all I know. But they converted everything over to Ampletrons in an early stage, and they made many other changes. I will not attempt to go into a full block diagram of this because there is going to be a block diagram and a complete technical discourse on the entire system at Montauk by Preston Nichols in a future book. So I'm not going to steal his thunder. It was a very complex system, involved a special tube computer, tubes, actually, not solid state, but this was designed and built in the late 60s, early 70s. It was built by an aerospace corporation on the island. And after the project was crashed and Preston and I and others went through, we found a nameplate and a tag on this huge tube computer. Literally stood from here almost to that wall. Several hundred, if not 1,000 tubes in it. And it was old tubes, and it was an analog type computer. But it had to be tubes because of the energies involved. Higher order energies cannot be amplified by solid state devices, at least not on any power level. There is work being done to change this, but I have not been terribly successful at it. One of the interesting side issues is trying to track down who built this hardware after we saw the remains of the station. And this computer had a nameplate on it. It happened to be the company that Preston was working for at that time, AIL, Airborne Instrument Laboratories Tourism on Island. He went to the sales department and presented these numbers and the date. He said, "I'd like to see the files on this." And they looked and said, "We have no files on this. We never built it." "What do you mean you never built it?" "I have here the data. I've seen the piece of equipment and the nameplate. We never built it. There's no records of it. Couldn't have." Well, my friend Preston went around in circles for a while with this and finally got over to a friend of his in security. And the head of security in the plant asked him, "Would you mind checking into this for me? There's something awfully strange here. I have this data from the nameplate for a piece of equipment which I've physically handled. I know it exists. But they seem to tell me that there are no records of this thing ever having been built here. What goes on?" I said, "Let me check into it." I'll give you an example of how the government covers up. Perhaps a week or so later, the same security man came to Preston and says, "Come down to my office." We did. Hands him a file. He says, "Is this what you're looking for?" He opens it up. Here's the pictures of the computer, all of the data on its manufacturer, and the pictures of delivery on base, photos of the people who accepted delivery, and among the pictures was a photo of me. At the time when Preston told me this, I didn't quite believe it. He said, "No, that was you." I said, "No, you had a little more hair then, but it was you." And that's correct, it was. There are other substantiating data which shows that that was the case. This entire project and all of the hardware manufactured for it is buried under a clearance level called black card clearance. It's the highest level clearance there is. The president does not even have access to it in some cases. Bush, of course, did, but other presidents prior and since have not necessarily had access. It's only on a need-to-know basis, and of course Bush, being the head of the CIA, had a need to know everything, so he did. But this was what he found. He showed him that, and of course it went back in the vault. And Preston found out, yes, the company did build them. And of course, since then, many things have happened. AIL's been split up also, and there's only 2 divisions still operating. One of them currently being run by the corporation is on the rundown mode. As the contracts run out, there will be no replacements, and eventually that division will fold up. The other division, the 3rd division, is taken over by Department of Defense directly. One of the divisions was sold to whom I don't know. But their cover was exposed, and this whole major investigation resulted in quite a few companies having the axe applied to them, among them ITT. That's sort of ahead of the story. Many of these projects are under that level of clearance, and because of that clearance, it means that there are no records kept outside of a black vault. People who are involved with it, whether it be sales department, purchasing, any aspect, engineering, all of those records are kept in the black vault when they're not directly in use, and they're only handed to people who have the proper level of clearance, and they need to know. The clearance level alone is not enough. This is the way the government operates, and has now for several decades. You must have first the proper level of clearance, and then you must have a need to know what is involved in the particular project. And if that's established, then you get the records. And that's how they bury them. You go into a black vault, nobody can find this stuff unless they have access. And it's well buried. Many projects are in that category. And of course, everything dealing with the little project at Montauk, sometimes called the Phoenix Project, but we called it the Montauk Project because of that phase of it which took place at Montauk, and Montauk was the primary engineering division which handled all of the experimental work. What was built at the other Montauk sites, or I should say the other Sage sites, where they were converted, and they all were at one time, was follow-on, and it was after they had the system working at Montauk. Now they found, in terms of the time tunnel work, that they didn't get very successful results running strictly from the IBM computers and the data which was put in the hard disk drives. There were 6 of them at one time, and 2 360s, later changed to 370s. So they were scratching their heads, and somebody finally came up with the idea, well, if we can't run this through a computer, at least not ours, maybe we should try getting a psychic in on this, see if he can add something to this program, can make this thing work a little better. A lot of experimental work was accomplished, much was done, and eventually, first ITT was in on it, then others. They came up with a reclining chair looking very much like a perhaps an aircraft captain's seat, which would lean back and recline. And many different systems were tried. They finally developed and adopted one. Basically what it was, they picked up the radiated body fields from the psychic, who would think about a particular place, location, perhaps set of coordinates, and that energy from that individual was transferred electromagnetically by one system and later by hardwire direct contact, 50 millimeter square surface skin contacts, which went through a very special alien computer. Then it went through a Cray 1B. There was several designs, and finally came up with a 1B that worked, would interface the alien computer. Then there was another one, a language interchanger from the alien language, because this whole system was designed by the Syrians. And then it would feed to 360, and everything worked fine when they finally got this going. It took a lot of work, about 18 months on that to straighten that mess out and make the thing work reliably. But there's a lot more to it than this. Duncan was the principal psychic on the chair operation. They had 4 rooms of 2 chairs each. They had a number of psychics who were trained for this, but they could not take a psychic off the street and say, okay, you sit down in the chair, we know you're good. Think about something and expect that that individual would automatically interface with the computer. It doesn't work that way. The computer recognizes certain symbolic logic and certain logical terms. Each one of those psychics had to go through another program as part of their training to be a psychic, to sit in the chair to operate this whole system. And that was what was called the VIR program, Virtual Interpretive Reality. And I think you've heard somewhere of virtual reality, particularly if you ever saw the movie The Lawnmower Man. That is accurate. Those mock-ups of the lab shots are not. I mean, that's Hollywoodized. But the idea of virtual reality training, taking a person who is almost a moron with an IQ of about 50 and pushing him up to an IQ of 500 is real, and it works. And there was a man, much like the Lawnmower Man, well, everybody went through that training program. There was a psychic up to level 5 And it not only increased the speed of response of the brain, it also was used for another purpose. And it did develop psychics too, that was another thing. It would increase the psychic ability, but they had to learn automatically to think of an object, and it was interpreted automatically into a logic format which was recognized by the computer. That's how they made the psychics work in the chairs. They had to be specially trained. They went down to Chesapeake Bay for this. It was not done at Montauk. That was another part of the operation, the VIR program. I know it well because I went through it myself. And I was so that I would know what the psychics were trained to do and would understand what they had to be able to do. There was a lot of work involved to develop the system and make it work. And this is just in terms of the engineering, hardware end. A great deal of work was involved. In terms of the theoretical aspects, well, we were dealing with something beyond ordinary time travel. There's nothing ordinary about time travel, but nevertheless I use that term in a relative sense. And they had to go beyond this. They had to understand how to shift the coordinates. Now, I don't have the proper slides made up yet. I thought I would have them for this particular presentation, but it seems like the man who said he could do it got tied up with a few problems, including his father having a heart attack and going in the hospital in Phoenix last week for a quadruple bypass surgery. So he didn't get very much of other things done. But I will eventually add these. Now, all of you, I'm sure, in your schooling, have learned about three-dimensional realities. The three dimensions we call length, width, breadth, the solidness, it's relative again, of an object, of our realities. If we hit a car at 60 miles an hour on a wall, we know very well it's going to destroy the car and kill whoever's in it, in spite of the fact that most of the atomic structure is empty nothing. It's relative. It's solid to us, and that's what matters. But it's also solid for another reason. The other reason is that you have a function called time, and time provides duration, because in terms of modern quantum physics, you have little quanta of time, and an object theoretically could exist for one quanta and then disappear if it didn't continue to exist as an increasing time stream flow, whether you want to call it quantum time or ordinary time in terms of the terminology which was used by von Neumann and particularly Tesla. Without time, an object or the universe would have no endurance. It is time which makes the thing real to us because it endures for some period of time until physical objects, of course, as we know, wear out, or we burn them or destroy them, whatever. But that element of time is essential for the endurance of a physical reality. There was something else beyond that. When we talk about time travel, I did not go into the Philadelphia experiment here, so I'll give you a little bit of an idea from the concept here as to what we're talking about. Using this little pointer as an example, let us say this represents the flow of time. It's essentially linear. We measure it with clocks, but this is what we call the element T1, or normal time, fourth dimensional time. And it flows, we say forward, that again is relative because there is a reverse time universe, but which is forward and which is reverse doesn't really have any meaning. They're opposite. But in our universe, we say time is going forward, time advances, we measure it with a clock. It's all arbitrary, but we accept it. But in this flow of time, you have something else that's involved. And that is a very interesting thing called the fifth dimension, or a time spinner. If I get a pen out here, I will give you a little idea of what we're talking about, at least in terms of graphics or vectoral analysis. The spinner is a vector at right angles to time. See, those things are all supposed to be at right angles. It's a vector which runs 90 degrees from around the main time, describing a helix, a corkscrew, if you will, much like the kids' little toy of those springs which would bounce around and you would get a wave of motion through this whole coil. Is another important concept because time also flows in a wave structure. Under certain conditions you can observe the effects that way. But the two elements of time, T1 and T2, the fourth and the fifth dimension, are extremely important because by manipulating the fifth dimension we're able to manipulate the visibility of an object in the Philadelphia experiment. And if you carry this one step further, beyond the so-called fifth dimension, with higher order energies and a sixth order differential equation, I don't know if there's anybody in this room who knows what a sixth order differential equation exists, but they do exist. And solving it is not exactly easy. It does take a computer. By means of that, the aliens showed us from their technology, which we did not understand initially and certainly had not developed ourselves at that point, they showed us how you could add an additional element. And that is a tunnel which not only went through time, but also you could use to change the physical reference where you were. Time travel says I can stand in front of this podium and change my time reference a year in the past, a year in the future, or more time than that or less. I'm still standing in front of this podium a year from now as long as the podium's here. Physically, I have not moved my location. Maybe the building collapses, but nevertheless, I would be in the same physical relative location on this planet. But in this system, they wanted to be able to shift that physical rotation or location and the same time, pardon the quote, at the same time they were shifting the time element or the reference so that you could move a person or an object through space and time simultaneously, either or both. And they sometimes use the space configuration transmission only with no change in the time reference. Other times they used the time only. And of course, most of the time they used both. It was that aspect of the Montauk program which was very difficult, which took so much time to develop, all kinds of hardware changes, concept changes, etc. And eventually they made it work. From about 1977 onward, they had a working system for the time tunnels. And that went onward. In 1979, they considered the work complete and functional, and they had a test program and a sign-off by the FAA involving a Montauk airport and an FAA station. And then it went into super secret mode of operation. Most of the rest of the military personnel which were on that base for this project were removed, and they went in from an outer perimeter to an inner perimeter, and both those perimeters still exist to this day, even though the base is essentially shut down and you might say almost wrecked, but not quite. It has been vandalized. But in any case, the inner perimeter was sealed with special military forces, and everyone was kept out of that. The outer one was the old base, which included Fort Hero, Montauk Air Force Station, and of course the Navy operations, which were basically on the lowest level underground. Interesting point I forgot to mention. We don't have any pictures of it now. Someday I may be able to get my hands on them again, because I did see the Army Corps of Engineer plans for the underground operations at Montauk, and that was in May of '86. And the nephew of Barry Goldwater came out armed with blueprints, tons of blueprints of all kinds showing the entire plan structure for Montauk Underground. How he got his hands on them, I don't know, but I presume that the senator has a few connections. We saw them at that time, and there were 6 levels, and still exist today, 6 levels of underground. And the interesting point is that back about 1925, or previous to that, there was only 1 level of underground in the original Montauk operation, and that was what was built for the Navy and for the Army. About 1928, somebody decided, and the Army Corps of Engineers built 5 additional levels of underground by literally stacking them up above ground, sort of like an apartment house. They went for miles. They were very extensive. When they got done with the 6th level, concrete and steel reinforced, very heavily reinforced, because at a later date came the radar tower, and it had to be anchored into this underground structure. When they were done with it, they brought in truckload after truckload of dirt, buried this thing under dirt so it looked like it was an ordinary hill, and then planted grass, bushes, trees, the whole 9 yards. So after a short period of time, it looked like this structure, this hill, had always been there. It looked like a normal, natural hill, and that's how they buried the underground. And of course, there were other military buildings on the surface which had access to the underground, and most of the major part of that base was built after the 30s. So today we still have that, and in the video which Preston did in January and February of the Montauk tour, it shows the structure as it stands today above ground, and you can see that there are some strange hilly structures there that you can't say they look artificial, but it's quite obvious that it's not part of the normal structure, because if you go over to the cliffs, which I do have in the slides and I'll show you shortly, you go to the cliffs and look back, you can see that this center section is elevated, and there's another level which is normal on the cliffs where a lot of fishermen today go with permits from the city of Montauk and do their fishing or whatever. But you look back at it, you can see that there's some strange hill structure there. When the project was fully underway, of course, they were exploring all kinds of things, and there were many projects going in addition to the time tunnel work. I mentioned the VAR program. We had other programs involving cultural exchange, relationships between the various alien groups. The slides will show you what ones we know that were there. And these slides, I might add, are not photos, they're sketches done by various people who were abductees at one time or another, and they're composite sketches, which were published in Matrix 1 and Matrix 2 over a period of years. These aliens provided much of the technical backup, and we provided the hardware by building it in various facilities around the U.S., such as Corning, ITT Corporation, RCA, Raytheon, AIL, and who knows how many others. We don't know all of the history now as to how many companies are involved. But the ITT Corporation was the principal contractor. They provided the interconnecting contracts for all of the corporations that were involved in providing hardware. They were the coordinator. And in the end, they were the ones who got the brunt of the breakup. But they coordinated the whole thing. They coordinated the monetary expenditures, and when, as I mentioned previously, they ran out of money, the Nazi gold from the Reichsbank, ITT Corporation filled it in, and of course came from the Krupps in Germany. And the reason they wanted to keep it as a private project was because they did not want government money in it, because when government money goes into a project, you have oversight committees, you have monthly reports, and the whole thing becomes public. This was one of the most deeply buried projects in the history of the world, much less the United States, which was financed privately to keep it private and to keep it with a low profile. Even though elements of the military were involved in it, they were funded out of other sections which they were transferred from. Jack Pruitt, for example, station master, was Air Force out of the Pentagon, and he got a salary out of the Pentagon. Most of the other military personnel there were TDY, as they call it, from other bases, from other locations, and their paychecks came from wherever they originally were assigned. So there was no additional funding from the government involved anywhere, for hardware, for operations, whatever. And of course the intelligence community, CIA, NSA, had enormous oversight, and naval intelligence. Naval intelligence is the biggest of the three, by the way, in case you didn't know it. There's some 65,000 employees in naval intelligence today. It's not exactly a small operation. But they were involved in the sense of knowing what was going on, oversight. But the programs, and here you get into an interesting political structure. The entire administrative program was run originally by Dr. John von Neumann, and when he had a problem with a split personality developing in 1977, he wanted to resign, and he says, no, you can't go. You can step down as director, we'll assign somebody else, but we need you to stay around for various reasons, which he did until the end. And the new director became Dr. Hermann C. Untermann, who was from Germany. He had his degree in physics, PhD, from Göttingen University in 1936. Was asked to join the Nazi Party. When you're asked to join the Nazi Party in the position he was in, you don't say no. So he joined, and he didn't like it, and he wanted out. And he was one of the people smuggled out of Germany by my father. We smuggled some 9 or 10 people out of Germany during that period from 1933 to 1942. They were still smuggling them out when the war was on. And Untermann was one of them. He verified this himself. He became the director of the project, and that means administrative director, run out of Lincoln Labs, MIT, in Cambridge, Mass. And he was administrative director of the entire operation there, all of the Phoenix projects involved, connected with that area. Now, there were other people above him. There were at least 3 more levels, and what I learned now, there were 4 more levels above him. I won't go into the names of them because all these people are still alive and still in some capacity functioning, interfacing with the government, or retired. And below Untermann, there was another hierarchy. We'll start with the man who was the station master, and that was Jack Pruitt. As far as we know, he's dead now. You had assigned to him a technical director. That man happened to be Dr. Fred Coopers, really, a German again. And I happen to know about him because his daughter, Helga Morrow, living in Tucson, Arizona, has done a lot of research and found out that her father was heavily involved in the Phoenix Project. We even found his office. And that's in the videotape. In any case, he became a technical director, and Preston Nichols was associate or assistant technical director. After a period of time, I became involved as the psychic director. Duncan and other people we know were involved in various levels. And above Kirpers and above Jack Pruitt, you had two more levels before you went to Herman C. Unterman. The first level was a man who is very well known today, and I'm not going to use his name because he is still in government service and is also well known. The second person was an alien, a Draconian. We called him Charlie. He was a very intelligent alien, a very intelligent Draconian, a reptilian basically. He had many, many degrees. He was on the older side, and if you don't know what I mean by older side, the reptilians typically live 10,000 years. So they can amass enormous amounts of information and education in one lifetime, which is very, very long. As long, of course, they're not killed in an accident or by some other means, but the normal lifetime can run 10,000 years. So he was there as the overseer of all of the alien interests for the Montauk Project, and by government agreement, a certain period of time was allowed for government usage and the private usage by those who had designed and built it, and part of the time was for alien usage and interest for their own agenda. And that was by government agreement, and he was in charge of all of the alien agendas and all the aliens, for that matter, on base. I'll get into this with the slides and give you a little better idea of what was involved here. But they also had another operation going, and that was a sort of cultural exchange. And this was run by a certain Ryan, who had long since forgotten what his name was. And of course, Charlie had a real name, but nobody could pronounce it, so we all called him Charlie. It was much easier than trying to pronounce his real name. He spoke English. They all spoke English. If you could communicate telepathically, they preferred that means. But most of the station personnel were incapable of telepathic reception or transmission, so they spoke English, communicated in a normal manner. But this cultural assistant, or ambassador was really his title, was there for the purpose of trying to, shall we say, teach us something of the cultural aspects of the Orion Confederation and some of the alien groups, their music, their culture, etc. We had 3 music rooms in the underground, believe it or not. One was for the humans, for their music, whatever they wanted, rock and roll, jazz, classical, whatever. There was another music room for the aliens, for their music. Most humans couldn't stand their music, and they couldn't take too much of ours. But there was a third, which was for special recording projects involving further conditioning and mind control experiments. And that one was very few people knew about. There was an interesting incident here that turned up. The Orion group would come in and listen to some of our music. There was one particular classical work they couldn't stand, and that was Mahler's First Symphony. The last movement drove them up the wall. They literally ran out of the room. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Mahler's First, but that last movement starts with a crashing cymbal followed by a full crescendo from the orchestra, which is enough to drive anybody who's not ready for it a little bit bananas. It drove the aliens completely bananas. So there were times when it's been played since for the purpose of keeping certain classes of aliens at a more than arm's length. That's one of the little incidents and anecdotes of Montauk. It was a huge base. There were a lot of people there at times. There were as many as 50 or more aliens at a time on the base, and other times it would dwindle down to a few administrative people. Those in the underground ran the operation, had access to the underground and knew exactly what was going on, but on the top side we had a lot of administrative personnel who were hired, either civilians or military, to do all of the paperwork, the office work, maybe purchasing, all of the usual 9 yards of work that has to be done with a major electronics project. They didn't know a thing about what was going on down below. They only knew their little bailiwick of work that they were to do. None of those people were brainwashed. There were a lot of females up there. There were a lot of other office personnel. Charlie had his office above ground as well as underground. And Preston Nichols had an office there and a lot of the other people. Some of us, of course, knew exactly what was going on, but most of the above-ground personnel did not. And it was a very large base. The pictures show that, those of you who saw them this afternoon, the size of the base is quite large. And some of the later shots we took in January of this year, which I have and will show even better the size of the base and its extensiveness. It's enormous. It's not a small base. And there's a lot of vacant ground in there yet to this day, which we don't really know why it's still there vacant, but it is. But that was a sort of a thumbnail sketch of what went on underground. Now later on, after they got all of this working with the psychics and the chairs and so forth, they did use a Cray 1B and they did convert to the 370s, but they never went beyond that because they were sort of married to the IBM 360, 370 series, and it was impractical. In fact, for that matter, the very large frame, high-speed computers that Cray has developed in the 80s, of course, they were not available to the project because we were already married to the 360, 370, and some of those didn't come online until 85 or 86, long after the project was over. If they had had something like that in the first place, it would have been a different story. They probably could have interfaced directly with alien computers. The Cray 2-1 can. And I'm quite sure there are some operations involving that type of cooperative effort, if you will. As the government has been in the business of cooperating with aliens for a long time, and that's a long story. The heavy cooperation began in 1954 when Eisenhower signed an agreement with the Greys at Edwards Air Force Base. There was a previous agreement, in case you didn't know it, signed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1934 with a different group called the Kondrashkin. We call it the K group, it's easier. They proposed, in fact, the nature of the deal was that they would help Roosevelt bail the nation out of the Depression by providing some new industries and so forth, and the government would provide them with underground bases. In 1938, from my information, they proposed to establish a complete new industry in the United States known as the atomic energy industry. The president was for it at first. The military was against it because they said, well, perhaps rather logically, if we don't have complete control over this from the beginning to the end, we don't know what these aliens may do. They know more about it than we do. They may ultimately have control, and we don't know what they will do with it. Therefore, cut it out. Don't go ahead with it. So Roosevelt turned around and changed his mind and said no. And they said, well, okay, if you want to do that, that's fine. There's nothing else we can do for you. And they disappeared into the woodwork. In 1940, something which I have not talked about too much, another group was formed, strictly human. And the intelligence people, at that time, intelligence operations were not too effective, not like they are now. They could not find out where this alien group had gone or what had happened to them. They literally disappeared in the woodwork. Somebody made a bright suggestion to Harry Bennett, who was then the principal advisor to President Roosevelt, and said, why don't you try getting one of these psychics? Maybe one of them can find out where these guys are hiding and what they're doing. Bennett liked the idea. Roosevelt liked the idea. They tried it. They hired some off the street, gave them a change of identity and such and a location to work, and it worked. That was the beginning of the Psych Corps, which exists to this day. And there's several Psych Corps now, but at that time, the original one founded by Harry Bennett, and later a man who headed it up and did all the training and set up the training courses and programs, became a very interesting operation because after, in 47, it was under control of the CIA, and in 1950, approximately when NSA came into being, National Security Agency, it was expanded and went under NSA control, where it still remains. That is the original operation. They found that they could set up training programs. They went out and selected people who, by test, looked like they were good and had some psychic ability. They had to demonstrate some ability to begin with, and they always wanted them in pairs. And there was always male, male, or female, female. You cannot use a male-female combination. Wilhelm Reich found out that answer why in his research for the CIA in 47 to 52. Found out a lot of other things too, but we'll go into that now. So they had these training programs which ran typically 5 years. It was a hands-on program, and you learned what to do and how to do it. And by the time you graduated from that, you were very good at it. Very good at it means that they could spy anywhere in the country or around the other side of the planet in a military installation and see by remote viewing what the Russians were doing or some other group were doing. The Russians had this program too, of their own. They were doing the same thing to us. But we had the capability, and this was used not only for military espionage, it's also used for espionage against aliens, it was used for espionage against Americans, and to keep tabs on who knew about certain secret projects and maybe got out with a few pieces of proof. Like, check this out, see if there are any pictures, files, records, movies of certain things, such as the Philadelphia experiment. And that gets into a very personal area because several times I've had the equipment, not equipment, but pictures and movies almost in my hand that would prove the thing. And each time, the government got in there first. Thanks to the Psych Corps, they were able to find out who had it, and the government agency appropriate would come and relieve the person of what evidence they had, to the point in one case of burning their house down to destroy some movie files they had. But this is what the Psych Corps has done. They've operated for many years, and I might add, as an aside, they also have a special little group that works in the White House to protect the president psychically. It's not well known. They will never admit to it. But I know some of the people who are involved with that project. That's how I know about it. This was one of the side issues that went on through that whole period, and of course they were involved to some extent with all of these projects, and they provided a certain amount of overview and coverage. And of course the intelligence communities relied very heavily on psychics, something which the public doesn't know and the universities deny, deliberately and for a reason. Oh, the psychic things like this doesn't exist, remote viewing doesn't exist, because they don't want the public to know that the government has a handle on this and is using it on a regular day-to-day basis. There are other people, of course, know that this is going on, and there are good psychics who work outside of the government. But the general educational system, public and college, denies that these things can exist. It's part of a planned program, just like ignorance on some of these other projects. Well, I think perhaps at this point we should get out to the slides, and I think we'll take a short break because he has to move the camera in order to be able to line up properly. Once again, a map of the area, show you where the Montauk Project took place. Down here, the extreme tip of the island, is this park area, and there's another park area here. There's a town called Montauk in here. And there's a major state park system there, and Montauk was bequeathed by the government, GSA, to the State of New York Parks Commission in January 186 to be developed as a park. An earlier map showed the Montauk Air Force Base inactive, but it doesn't show on this particular AAA map, which was issued about in 1990. That's where it took place, other than the other 24, which were on the periphery of the U.S. We don't need to go into those because they were essentially carbon copies. Now, I mentioned that there were many aliens involved. I'll give you a little idea. The one on the left was a typical Orion reptilian. They have a very strange skin, sort of leathery. They stood about 6 feet high. The one on the right was a draconian. Typically those who ran and controlled the Greys. The Draconians ran about 7 feet high. A strangely different appearance. They had 5 fingers, unlike the Greys, only had 4. They were very regal. They were very, I guess one should say, arrogant. They didn't think much of humans. They were forced to work with humans for reasons of their own and by agreement with the government, where the treaties have been made between the United States government and the alien nation, so to speak. So they learned to work with the humans. Some of the Draconians, one Charlie, changed his attitude after a number of years, was a lot less arrogant and a lot less despising of humans, much less after a while. Typical grays like the lower right. If you see some of the other pictures more close up, which I have another one, will give you a little better idea what they were. There was more than one type of gray. In fact, the information is that there are 6. The one on the upper left was one of the very old grays, typically 1,200 years old or more. They were 7 feet high and very thin, and didn't particularly like humans, but at the same time, they were not as anti-human as the small grays. The smaller ones, as typified by the lower picture, and this one of an anatomical study where they were typically 3.5 feet high, was sexless. They were neither male nor female. They had lost the ability to procreate, and they, shall we say, kept the species going by means of a cloning process and using human females in many cases as the carrier for the impregnation for the first trimester or the first 13 weeks. And there are thousands of cases on record medically where babies started growing in the wombs of mothers, and then suddenly after 13 weeks they weren't there anymore. The medical doctors scratched their head. How can this happen? Well, it was all run by the Greys, and they would then take that partially grown new gray into the underground laboratories and complete their growth in tanks and other various means they had, and they were born as a full adult. There was no growing up period. But they were highly intelligent, telepathic, but they had apparently, at that time, not too much will of their own. They were totally dominated by the Draconians and by others in the Orion complex. They were there as sort of the workers, the clones, if you were, and they were in the underground. They got underfoot. In fact, sometimes they got in the way. And they had a terrible odor. Preston tells a story how many times he watched some of the workers there pick these grays up. They're only 3.5 feet high, very frail, lightweight. Throw them in the shower in the hope that they could get rid of the odor. They didn't. Finally, somebody quipped, well, try a can of Lysol on them. They did. And guess what happened? They loved the stuff. They got drunk on it. Lysol became a standard item in the commissary of the underground from that point on. So there were some strange little side issues here of things that went on in the underground. This was an anatomical study showing the structures of the hand. They only had 4 fingers. They were almost like claws with long nails, and they had an extra digit in their hand. We have 3 bones. They have 4. And in other words, third phalanx, first, second, third, plus the originating bone from the hand structure. And they have very long arms for their body size. This was the other major group, Syrians from Sirius A. They looked nearly human, but they had vertical slit eyes, cat-like, very muscular, very, very intelligent, and they provided most of the technical backup for the operations, not only for the Orion Confederation, but for what was going on in the underground there. They provided a great deal of technical expertise. And they were more or less under contract, from what we understood, to the Orion Confederation, therefore were working with them. They didn't seem to exhibit any independence of thought at that time. The reports that came back from various sources indicated there were many modes of mind control and conditioning originated by the Syrians. This was one sketch done by an abductee who had been through the mill, showing attachments to the body for mind control, and later on the development of a chair with a helmet for doing the same sort of thing. This was probably the precursor to the one that was developed for the psychics at Montauk to control the whole system. Because we found the mind control worked much better than a computer, if you interfaced with a computer, to steer the thing, because you could have in the computer all of the cutting edge of technology, of physics, celestial coordinates, things for our solar system. Eventually they plugged in the data for the rest of the galaxy as known, and they went exploring at the same time. And they were able, through the computer data that they had and the psychics working with it, to explore wherever they wanted. Now that's part of the past. Now in 1986, or 86 I went back there, 85 I went back there, the project crashed in 83. How did it crash? I gave a little bit of an indication of this. And this was again due to the fact that Preston, Duncan, and a few others decided the station had done so many bad and evil things, and we'll get into one of them a little bit further down, that they decided that a station had to be destroyed, and it was destroyed with Junior doing the job, or helping to do the job, on the late afternoon and evening of 12 August 1983. Nonetheless, when we went back here exploring many times, in the summer of 91, I went back in here with Preston, and in 92. In 92, I took many of these pictures. We found evidence that the station was again being reactivated. Well, let's get into part of that. But one of the things we found here was this neat little sign showing that Fort Hero was being turned over to the Parks Commission of the State of New York for development as a park. They haven't done anything, whatever, to develop it as a park. We found in the summer of 92 this new Coast Guard station antenna, which may not have any connection with the revived operations on the base, but in documenting what we saw, we took a lot of pictures showing the loading box, the cables, and the feed line of very large coax which came over from the other installation, which was right adjacent. This again was another shot of the loading coil box, tuning box, if you will. And this was the actual transmitters. There were two confined within that fence. They were fed by their own power system, gasoline electric generators, and put out certain signals which were part of the normal Coast Guard and coding for navigation. We went looking to see what we could find. We found a lot to show that there's something was no longer the same, that they were reviving the base. We found this telephone junction box on the ground, which looking at it was quite new. It wasn't something dating from 1980s or even the 70s. It dated from the 1990s. And we kept looking, and we found still more. We found brand new telephone junction boxes on the telephone poles, which were not old either, by the way. And these things were brand spanking new with fresh paint on them, which says, well, they're running new phone lines in here for something. And we found new line transformers on poles. Preston looked into this and found that from the information from Lilco, this Long Island Lighting Company, these were recently installed, and they were capable, since there was a three-phase line, of handling something like 4.5 kVA, 4.5 megawatts of power. As I say, 4.5 million volt amperes. That's a lot of power. Equivalent of 4.5 megawatts at zero power phase. You know, and where did this go? It went down the pole and went to a little building, not too small, but actually containing nothing more than a truck. It was a auxiliary building for maintenance. Had no equipment in it, nothing in there, but the cables went in there, and outside on the door they had a three-phase digital watt meter, which measured each phase separately, recorded it someplace, and then the three combined. And this thing went merrily on its way the whole time we watched it, and it was going on 24 hours a day. And there was also, for those of you who were electrical engineers, a 200-to-1 current transformer in this little digital watt meter, which says to measure the power, they had to cut it, the current level down 200-to-1, and then make measurements, and of course, compensation for that. A lot of power was involved. We don't know where it went, except it went underground. We found all kinds of things here. In this case, some more strange hardware, changed cable runs. In fact, that is a coax cable there. Preston's holding it up with his hand. That was a brand new coax cable. It wasn't weathered and rotting like some of the older ones, but it was quite new. This cable here that he holds in his hand is a large one. It goes into the radar tower and it goes on up into the old antenna structure on the roof. Some newer pictures of the radar tower. The building is still, as you mentioned, sort of pinkish. That was the original color. The antenna is done on mixed red and white. And it's still there, still intact, though the drive motors have been stolen. We don't know how they ever got them off the roof. They weighed several tons each. But somebody was very enterprising and they stole the 4 motors. Another close-up of the antenna. and the radar tower. Now you might note in this shot something which was not extant in the period of the early 80s. On the extreme left wall, you see a line that is a ground wire going up to the top and grounds the antenna base with a new fresh grounding system, which means they were doing something new. Notice the bottom structures there, the old air conditioners, they were bent and smashed out of shape. That was probably when they dropped the shrouds for the motors down, which are still laying on the ground. The motors are long gone. Who got them, we don't know. Some close-ups on the antenna structure, taken on the roof, gives you a little better idea of the size and structure of the feed lines, the feed horns, and the RF coax waveguide system, which was in the buildings underground cryogenically cooled with their own little nitrogen generating plant in the basement. They were dumping so much power through the system until they abandoned the antenna on the roof and went to the Delta T antenna underground, that they had to use cryogenic cooling for most of it. All the waveguides might have melted. This is where one of the motors of the four existed. You can see parts of the gearbox train. And we just did this as documentation. This was taken in January, I think it was the 14th, when we were all on the roof. That's Peter Belts on the left, who is producing a special video which is yet to be completed for commercial release in Japan. This was this year, in January 14th through 17th we were there. It was Peter Belts, Duncan, current picture of him, some of the other crew looking around from the roof of the radar tower. And the man in the foreground with the hood over his head was Preston Nichols. It was a rather dreary day. It was very cold that day, too. A high wind was blowing, and you don't get too close to the railing because the railing is weak, and in sections the railing on that roof is already collapsed. To give you a little better idea of the intricacy and the strength of that structure, it's still standing. We don't know how much longer it may stay up there. It does rotate a little occasionally, but we found out there's a chain winch manual steering system for the antenna. And we also found something else, looking very carefully. That famous coax line I mentioned from the ground level comes up all the way through the radar tower. We were able to trace it, and here's part of it here, going up to the top of that antenna. Now they do not use currently the actual radar antenna itself. It's used as a pedestal to hold another antenna on top. Again, you can see part of the cabling and the general structure of this entire antenna is very massive. That's why it's still there. But the antenna they're currently using is this one up there. It's not an omni, it's a directional with a rotator. And we traced the coax cable all the way up. As far as we know, the only purpose for using that today up there is to establish the E field component for the time shift. You must have an electrostatic field interacting with the H, or magnetic field, and the gravitic field in order to do the time number, so to speak. And this above ground is the only thing we know of that's operating above ground, is that antenna. We took some shots again, or I did, on my camera, of the surrounding territory. Way off here in the distance, right here, is the old Montauk Lighthouse, the oldest lighthouse in the U.S., originally authorized by George Washington. And it's still standing. There's solid rock there, contrary to what the Air Force would have people believe, that this is all built on sand and therefore there could be no underground. More disinformation. Some more of the buildings. And if you may not be able to see it clearly because of the light level, but here is part of the concrete parapet, and you can look to see it faintly in there, is Junior, still standing there. This is January of 1993. He hasn't moved. The video camera also caught him. Preston Nichols didn't expect that, but he found panning from the roof that he caught Junior also in the video camera. Some more shots. A dreary day it was, but it gives you a little better view of the whole territory in winter. It's quite dreary. We also found last summer something new, a steel door, quarter-inch plate steel with double padlocks. People tried to force it open, they couldn't. This means definitely they were hiding something because the door previously was not there. The old door was just sprung open, anybody could walk in and out, no more. Come January, we come back, and we find this. Somebody blew a hole through the concrete blocks of the wall so they could get in and out, and it's just barely big enough to climb in and out as Peter Belts is looking out from the inside. So that was our access to the roof of the prior pictures. It's very convenient. They probably have bolted that or covered it up since, but this was the way it was in January. I did a lot of other documentation. This was the old transformer switch yard. And if you're familiar at all with electrical coding, in 1984, a law was passed saying you could no longer use PCB as a coolant in transformers. And they had to put a label on saying that it was non-PCB, so here was one of the newer transformers sitting there, obviously put in after Montauk was supposedly shut down. It raises some questions. What were they attempting to do, and what were they attempting to cover? So far as we know, this one was not been connected, but it was sitting there waiting for something. The old powerhouse, which they used in the original stage system, so took pictures to document it. And this shows some idea that they had four diesel generators, four diesel engines running these big generators in the front, each one of which, this is one of them here, and it's covered with paper shrouding because they tried to preserve them, were capable of putting out somewhere between 2.5 and 4 megawatts each, according to the information from Wilco. They were able to run half of Long Island at one time, and they probably did once, but when they ran into problems with the time tunnel system, the fields generated interfered with the functionings of these generators. They couldn't keep them in phase or in sync, so they finally abandoned the powerhouse and went to Wilco Power. And their generators, of course, are much further west on the island. There's a famous circle today, highly overgrown. The place is a little bit unkempt, but some areas show the effects of regular lawn mowing, which doesn't make any sense. Not for an abandoned base. The cliffs, which I mentioned, in the extreme eastern tip there, are fairly high up. They're about 75 feet over the ocean water. And on the surface is sand, but if you look more closely, you will find it isn't all sand. Now, one of the other projects, which was one of the major projects in Montauk, was the so-called kids program. The Montauk kids, as we call them, they were indoctrinated and brainwashed, chosen in the age brackets between 12 and 16 typically. Over 10,000 were processed through Montauk. And we found, this is the entrance to one of the underground bunkers, which years ago was ammunition storage. But we wandered in here finally, more than once, but this time with cameras with proper equipment to take pictures. This 5-sided room was described by a number of the survivors of the Montauk Kids program who remembered being part of it. They were rejected for one reason or another, and some of them had the scars yet from the meeting, because that was the earlier phase. And they remembered this 5-sided room, which we finally located, where they would be sitting in tears watching some of their younger compatriots being beaten in submission to the program, which was early on Reichian technology, which is to say, if I put it in the polite terms, Reichian related to the orgone energy, but it was a psychosexual type of programming technique. And in that state, when you reach the orgastic state, the subconscious mind is locked to the conscious mind, and therefore the whole channel is wide open for programming or reprogramming the person's mind. The earlier phases used physical programming techniques. I won't describe it, but you can probably get my drift. And later on was changed to electronic. But many of the kids wouldn't go along with it, others would. They were beaten to submission. Some of them died. And they had bleachers here where they would force the others to watch and say, you too will get this treatment if you don't give in. So most of them did. These children were taken from all over, originally Long Island, but then it was expanded to all over the United States. In the later phases of the program, they were basically street kids. They had no roots, no homes, had left home or were abandoned, whatever. And in that age bracket, they wanted them around puberty. And of course, puberty is not the same age for everyone.
What is the goal of the program?
I'm sorry?
What was the target? What was the goal of the program? How was it
That is a very good question, which we today are still trying to find the real answer to. We know they were programmed for operations in 1995 and 96 because I became part of that program in the later phases where it was changed to electronic programming. In other words, stopped the beating and the guy who was doing it was put on other programs. But the final goal, purpose for this programming, we never were told. It would not tell us. Well, many of us asked questions and they simply refused to give us the information. We can assume, knowing the way the government works, or I assumed, that it was probably for such purposes as being spies, saboteurs, assassins, whatever of that nature, general stirs of mayhem, riots, whatever. But the programming, as I described this afternoon, the techniques for contacting them were rather exotic but yet fairly simple, like they would get a message in their head to call a phone number. There may have been other means, but that's the one that was very obviously came to mind because it was replicated. Now, the final usage of these programs for these kids, we don't still understand, but we do know there was a very special program involved, and some 10,000 were processed at Montauk. And since there were 24 other stations operating, we have assumed, and we don't know for sure, that they were processing kids like this at some of these other locations. The potential was about 250,000. And you talk about your milk carton kids disappearing. Many of them were never returned to where they came from. Others were. The reason was that as street kids, they had no homes, no roots, and they become part of the program. If they were accepted the program and were given their training and came out, they didn't remember anything about what had happened to them in the processing. But we're told that they would go, in the later part of the program, they were told that the government would support them. They would not be any more a street kid. They would get themselves an education to whatever level they could sustain, PhD if they could, if they wanted to, and become a normal member of society and take a normal job in a normal position. And at that point, when they were working, earning their own living, the government support ended. And they were told they would never remember anything about this program, only know that the money was there and account for them, and they wouldn't even know how it got there.
Until they were needed?
Until they were needed and tapped on the shoulder, so to speak. And
95,
then
96?
this was scheduled for 95, 96. There has been some reprogramming in the last 6 months. We don't know exactly why. But they were...
Find survivors? How did they...
I'll get into that in a little bit. But these kids in the earlier phases were beaten into submission, and we made explorations. This is one of the long underground tunnels. It's not truly underground in the fact that it's in the 6 levels of underground. It's half above the surface, half below. This part of the bunker was below surface. It was originally used for ammunition storage, but it was used later for a lot of other things. This was after the World War II had ended. It was converted for use of treating the kids. And these hallways went on and on. We documented everything we could. There were rooms here probably for interrogation. Some of the old furniture is still there. The ceiling had come down in one of the rooms. We don't know why. It looked like a fire, but we couldn't be sure. Rather destroyed. We don't know when this happened. It was certainly not that way during the active period. But we kept walking. We found strange byways and passageways. We even found electrical equipment that was still operational, although whether the main power input was on or not, we could never fully determine. And this woman, Helga Morrow, whose father was Dr. Cooper's, one of the people involved in the project, wanted to come out in January to explore this herself. And she did finally determine positively her father was part of this project. He was a very proper German, born, raised and educated in Germany, came to the United States prior to World War II. Actually, perhaps slightly after the war was over. I'm not sure the dates myself. He was part of Project Paperclip, as far as we know. Now, she went down with us to the end, and she had her own impressions of what went on here. Now, this was what we found at the end of this passageway. This barbed wire containment with doors which originally were locked. And they kept the kids in here who had been beaten, usually naked, and they were stored and laid out, if you will, on these pallets, unconscious. Some of them recovered and some of them didn't. There was quite a number of those who did not recover from these beatings and were severely beaten. And they were kids, age 12, 14, 15. When you talk about Auschwitz and Dachau, we had our own here in the United States.
Did you know that was going on while you were there?
Yes, and I objected to it and eventually had it changed. They had to develop newer techniques in the old Reichian orgiastic techniques, which were physical. They finally developed electronic equipment which would replicate the same condition in the body through electronic means, so no physical contact was necessary other than the probes in the body.
Why is it that you have not been threatened in any way to reveal this information to the public?
It's a very long story. All I can say is the government won't touch me, and I know why, but I won't go into it fully. Part of it is because when you have gone public, such as other people who've been here, once you go public and have a following, the government does not dare touch you for one reason. To remove you from the scene is saying in the bottom line, well, this person obviously knew what he was talking about, and they did him in. If they leave that person alone, then people can speculate, well, the government hasn't touched him. Maybe he knows what he's talking about, maybe he doesn't. But the government hasn't endorsed it by doing him in or removing him from the scene. They did this to Morris K. Jessup in 1959, and they've never pulled his number since, not to my knowledge. But Helga was doing a reading. This is all on videotape also. She was not pleased with what she found down there. The first time I went in, I felt the vibes of these sick and dying kids, and it was really horrible to sense what had gone on years before. This is meaning going back in the summer of '92 and again in '93 when I took these pictures.
She was psychic, is she? She was doing psychic
Very.
reading?
She was very psychic. She could read the energies of these kids who felt the utter hopelessness of their position. They didn't know why they were there. They saw their buddies, so to speak, being beaten and dying, and they felt a complete dead end of hopelessness. And that's what you could read very readily, even to this day.
Were there girls too?
No. The programs for this conditioning were all males. There's an interesting side issue here, which we don't still fully understand. I know because I was involved with the program later that they also programmed in terms of their sexual orientation. 70% were programmed homosexually and 30% hetero. Now, we don't know really the reasons why, but there were some reasons. We couldn't get answers on everything, even though I became in charge of the program in the later phases and threw the guy out that did the beating and treated the kids much more humanely and allowed them to leave if they didn't want to go through with the program. They said, okay, you can get out, but you'll never remember being here. Those who completed the program or agreed to complete and were successful in doing so were supported by the government and could get an education. Many of these kids have turned up in the Long Island area in the last 6 to 9 months, and they're very readable. They're very obvious. If you have any psychic ability to see auras, you can see and recognize a signature from Montauk. Preston is not psychic, but he knows body language extremely well, and he can read the same thing in terms of body language. But these guys have been through the mill at Montauk.
What are their ages now?
At that time, they were treated, they were anywhere from 12 to 16. Today, you're looking at them being in the mid-20s to late 20s. And that would be their age now.
Is this a program with the knowledge of which would go to the president?
Good question. A lot of this was highly secret. This was part of some of the old Nazi programs. It was also part of programming the kids for, as I say, reasons we don't still understand fully. But it was a major part of the Montauk operation, and I might add there was a side program going on at a nursing home in Jamaica, Long Island, which was under direct control of NSA. Now, this program here entailed entirely, or almost 100%, Aryans, blonde-haired, blue-eyed kids. And they were split off for other programs. Other than that, if they were determined to be good potential psychics, they would be split off into a psychic training program. If they were determined to be very good for some other aspect that was wanted, they would be pulled out for that and not go through the standard programming. Well, this was Preston and Helga going down to the end of the line of the wall, so to speak, of that long hallway. And this was a picture of Duncan at the time carrying my camera case and the kerosene lantern. The kerosene lanterns was provided enough light for the very sensitive camcorder that was being used. As you can see there in that picture, he was almost in tears. 2 minutes later, he was in tears because it finally hit him what he had been involved with at the time when he was active at Montauk in programming the kids. He really broke down and cried.
He had worked with them himself?
Yes, he was. He was one of the principal programmers of the kids. This is the Montauk Lighthouse, as I say, over 200 years old. You can see there it's on solid rock. The Air Force tries to tell people that that's all sand there. That's nonsense. There is sand on top, of course, but it's mostly solid rock. And we found outcroppings of rock all over, indicating there was real heavy granite or similar structure, basalt rock structure underneath that loam and sand on top. One of the other things we found is may have been the remains of a gun emplacement long since torn down, and the lighthouse in the background. And one of the other interesting and curious features in the town of Montauk itself is this 8-story high building. Built in 1926, there's a bronze placard indicating it was built for an office building, was never used for it. If you examine it today, meaning 93, you will find no cracks in the walls, no shifting of the foundation. It's in very good shape. It's used for part residence, part office, and partly the local police department. They have well, you may see on the top a plethora of antennas. But according to the Air Force, it's all sand and dirt out there, no rock. Well, if that were the case, this building would have split on the side walls internally and externally long since. But there's no evidence of any foundation shift. It's built on solid rock. And we did find this U.S. Air Force Station, stating flatly it was Montauk Air Force Station, the usual warnings about entering the base. This sign was still there, so the Air Force cannot deny that it was also an Air Force base. That was the proof. One of those signs, a smaller version, is now in Preston's private collection at his lab. That was the big one. We didn't take it with us. And of course, some of the crew, and it was cold weather that day with some snow on the ground. At the park, at the end, there's a little park. And this was taken internal to one of the buildings, and part of the shoot they did, Duncan out on the balcony and the microphone for a video recording. One of these days it will probably be finished. But like so many things, these people run short of money. The Montauk cats, well fed and pampered by the tourists there. All of the animal life fled Montauk about 1976-77. Deers, animals, cats, birds. They all fled to the west or whatever direction they could. Animals, of course, had to fly by foot to the west. Birds just flew out any direction they chose. And there was no animal or bird life there of any kind until very, very recently, when we found one deer coming back in. This was this winter period of '93. And also these cats. And totally devoid of animal life. They could not stand the vibrations, the feelings, the energies generated by that station. They were absolutely bizarre. The weather went bizarre, it went bananas. When they had the station operating, there were cases on record or a July or August day of 85 degrees. Half an hour later, it was down to 32 degrees and snowing in the middle of the summer. Many other bizarre reports like that. The whales went nuts, the fish went nuts out in the adjacent ocean areas because it's a Long Island Sound to the north and the open ocean to the east. Now let's get into another aspect very briefly in terms of theory, the so-called torus of time. According to Einstein and those others who have worked with this whole business, time is in the form of a torus. It is the helical structure. That's not very well focused. It doesn't want to focus very well. And you have on the edge of this donut, if you will, the reality which we know and exists, and the helical structure, which is T2, or the fifth dimension, which goes like a corkscrew through time, is not a linear, open-ended structure. Einstein said years and decades ago that There's nothing like a straight line in this universe. Everything is curved, including time. And if you start out, let's say from in front of you, with what you think is a straight line, continue to go forward long enough and far enough, you'll eventually hit yourself in the back. Time is also a closed loop. But the thing that we did at Montauk, and we'll not get into, in the Philadelphia experiment, we'll not get into the aspects of Montauk here, was there are alternate realities. If you go 90 degrees around that helix, you'll be in another reality, and there's a total of 7 maximum. But in terms of the Philadelphia experiment, if you go approximately 60 degrees around the edge of that helix towards an alternate reality, you no longer reflect electromagnetic energy. And of course, if you don't reflect it, you don't see the object. You must have some form of reflection in order to see an object, whether it be a person standing in front of you or in radar with an object like a plane or a ship. No reflection, no image. Now, you cannot do a total absorption because that will show as a black hole on the screen, an area of just blackness, and that would be a giveaway also. So it was a very neat trick, very involved in terms of the forces involved, and of course using this torus of time in terms of the Montauk Project was even more complex. The government has found out how, by the way, to build hardware to get into the alternate realities, but that's another long story I don't go into now. But it is a closed donut-like structure, and time does look, in terms of our mathematical portrayal, much like that. In reality, it is something a little different than that, but this is a means for expressing the idea of what is going on and how time works. Because they knew, and we found out after the project was over, and back in 86, 87, in that time period, Preston did some experimental work on his own, being an avid radio amateur. He found, examining the background noise on radio receivers between stations, that there was a periodicity in the change in the noise level. And there was a definite period involved. With the help of his company and the sanction of his company, he took a lot of empirical data and technical data, and they crunched the numbers through their big mainframe computer and finally came up with the answer, already known by the aliens in the way they set this whole thing up, namely that there is a biorhythm to the planet Earth. 4 biorhythm cycles. The human body has 3. And these 4 biorhythm cycles have a period where they all peak out once every 20 years. I'll give you one guess of what the day is. 12th of August, 1943, 63, 83, 2003. And that was known, and they chose that final date for our test as the 12th of August to make sure that the elders would be in 43 on one of the node points, one of the peak out points. And the project in Montauk had orders to turn on and run 24 hours a day until they had received further orders from August 1, 1983 onward. And it was so running, because in the period when we made the test, 22 July, the first test with the elders, there was no lockup, there was no problem other than the radiation, the extreme electromagnetic level of radiation affecting the personnel. When the final one, which was on not 22 July, but 12 August, the ship disappeared into hyperspace and was locked there, and we had to go back and smash the equipment to bring the ship back to its normal point in the harbor of Philadelphia in 1943. Becomes extremely involved, and there are some final reports on this, highly classified. But Von Neumann knew the story, and he knew what was going on, and he is now retired, and also is now pretty much out, hate to say it, but pretty much out of his mind. He has an alternate type of personality now, which occasionally comes out of. But that was the reason why the 2 experiments locked up, was that little element known as Mother Earth and the 4 biorhythms peaking out once every 20 years. There's another aspect involved in this, namely the problem involved, as engineers will understand, if you have an improperly terminated transmission line, you have reflected energy. And it will go from the wave will go from the point of origin back up to the final end, and if it's improperly terminated, you get a reflected wave that comes back down to the point of origin with a standing wave problem, which says that the amplitude of that signal varies as you go up and down the line. because it's not properly damped in terms of its proper impedance. If it's the proper terminating impedance, there is no standing wave, there is no reverse wave. Time is much the same. There are standing waves in time, there is a reverse wave in time. The wave structure of time is very similar to what we know in electromagnetics. They're all interlocked. This is one of the things we learned. The electric field, the gravitic field, the magnetic field are all interlocked with the time field, and that's in the general field theory, unified field theory. It's not in the earlier equations, and it was completed and given to the governor in 1938 at the Institute. So they're all interlocked, and you do have interactions, and one of the problems was, of course, we ripped, or I should say the two projects locking together ripped a hole in space-time 40 years wide, which was for the convenience of the aliens that wanted to get large ships and large numbers of aliens through, which they did successfully. And in the process of doing that, of course, with such large numbers coming in, aliens have been on this planet some time immemorial, but in small numbers. They started to show up in larger numbers in 47, and by 53 it was a mob scene practically. And the deal was made between Eisenhower and the aliens. We do not interfere in each other's civilization. We provide them with underground bases. There will be technical interchange. And this included medical information. We will help them with creating, supposedly, a new race, a lot of genetic experiments which now involve humans as well as aliens. And all the 9 yards of that, due to that ripping of a hole in space-time and letting large ships and large numbers of aliens in. Additionally to that, it created another problem. Like the improperly terminated line, because time is a wave function, you open up a hole, you chop it off, it's not properly terminated. The normal flow is continuous and smooth. So you create a problem with standing waves in time. There was a problem with the reverse wave, which was solved in 1963 by a special project I don't have the time to go into, and it involves people I can't name other than Dr. John von Neumann, who was heavily involved. And they did solve it and damp it in 63, or this continent would be under the ocean right now. The reverse time wave structure hitting the node point in 63 could have disrupted the tectonic plates, and they knew it, and sunk most of the North American continent under 500 to 700 feet of ocean water. It didn't happen, obviously. We're here talking about it. They did solve the problem. But from 83 onward, for another 20 years to the next node point, there is a period where this structure damps out. Electronic engineers know what I'm talking about the damping factor of a wave as it slowly terminates down to the zero line. This function is not something which occurs naturally, this damping. It requires something to provide the damping. Since they had no hardware to do this, it wound up that two people, Duncan and myself, biologically were the dampers, and we don't understand why. And we are the damping. They have to keep us alive until at least the year 2003 by hook or by crook, or by whatever means, to keep this thing going, damping out till the year 2003, after which there's no problem. And I suppose at that point they can get rid of us if they want to. But the problem is then solved and damped unless they reopen the project. And that's the problem right now. We know they have reopened the project. We do not know for what purpose. It is back online. And there is a semi-node point coming up this August 12th of 93, 10 years between. It's the midpoint. And if they want to play games and hanky-panky, they can do it there and then. We do not know what the government's up to because we do not have any connections with them now. We're not privy to their thoughts and processes and what they want to do. But they're up to something.
You can't get psychic with them on them?
Oh, we can get psychic inputs on this. But nevertheless, that isn't the bottom line as to what they're really up to. Because they are quite capable of shielding much of their thinking and their thought processes and those people who are involved with the project.
Does all of these does the volcanic earthquake activity that we've been experiencing all over the world have anything to do with this?
Possibly it could, because after the project crashed in 1983, they moved the project to Germany under the guise on the name of Project Marla. It was continued in West Germany for a number of years and may still be operational there. And they eventually built some new projects in the U.S. at different locations. The follow-on Phoenix projects up to P7, P8 and P9. P7 is a portable system which is on helicopters, naturally black ones, and 3 of them flying in tandem under control of one navigational system with one pilot can pass over an area, and by means of the highly modified newer systems, a little lower power, they can go over a city and affect mood control, or if they want to focus down to a tight area, they can affect mind control of a number of people, a group in that area, induce riots or stop riots or whatever they want to do. A fine example of what they did was the Gulf War. After we invaded Iraq proper with American troops, it took 4 days for the war to end. And as you may have noticed on CNN or other television news reports, there were vast numbers of these Arab troops, many of them hardened and seasoned from many years of fighting with Iran, came out with their hands up, surrendered, kissed the hands of their captors on TV, on CNN, I watched it, and 175,000 of these troops literally gave themselves up and surrendered in 4 days, and the war was ended. Why?
Well, one of the generals made a slip on CNN.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. And Preston Nichols caught it. I did not see it. Well, he said, when he was questioned on a live program, how do you explain that so many of these Iraqi troops came out of their bunkers from underground and surrendered so readily? And he was sort of a little puffed up and elated over the whole scenario that was over. He says, well, we were testing out a new psychological, and coughed and choked, and says, well, a new sound system on the helicopters in which we moved over the bunkers and we induced them to surrender. Really, these bunkers, several hundred feet underground in some locations, buried under sand, you do not transmit sound through layers of sand that thick. It's not possible. It was electromagnetic, higher order energies which induced a mind control function. They eventually scaled down in the press the number of people who had surrendered. And I know the Arizona Republic said 175,000 in the first announcement. Then before a week went by, it was down to 60,000.
Well, does it occur to anybody that they could use that technology on the French troops?
They can use this technology on anyone.
But the bomb is left there on purpose.
Yes. The whole war was, so far as I can determine, and other people seem to think also, that it was a test bed for new technologies.
Just like Vietnam.
Just like Vietnam.
Now, wasn't some of that time travel technology used experimentally on structures in Vietnam?
Yes, there was. There's a long history of some of that, and I happen to be privy to some of the information due to talking with a person who ran some of the equipment. There was a Phoenix Project ongoing in Vietnam. And of course, the Phoenix Project is ongoing to this day, is an umbrella, covers many different things. But the story I got was in about 1965, one of the Army sergeants, he was actually not even an officer, was given this equipment for testing in Vietnam, in which 4 posts, approximately 18 or 24 inches in diameter, stood about this high, were set on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. 2 on either side on the north end and 2 on either side on the south end, and maybe a half mile apart. There was a control console for these 4 posts, if you will. And there was no interconnecting wire between any of these elements or the control console. When it was turned on, the 4 posts disappeared. You couldn't see them. And then what would happen was that the Viet Cong coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail would pass in the area which was controlled by these 4 electronic, whatever they were, posts. They disappeared. They were never seen again. Nobody knows. And the man who handled this equipment described it to me directly, and I talked with the man who was in charge of this. I won't say how this happened, but nevertheless, he described the equipment. There were no rivet marks, no bolts, no nuts, no weld marks, no indication of how it was assembled. There was no interconnecting cables of any kind. There were no known power sources. And he said the problem that developed was after a certain period of time, the field, which you couldn't really see, but which sometimes you could almost detect a little glowing, it started to expand from beyond the Ho Chi Minh Trail, went out several hundred feet or several hundred yards eventually, and American troops going down one side of the trail started disappearing. He, by radio, contacted his superiors and said, this is going on, we better shut it down. And he was told, leave it on. I want to see how far it expands. He didn't. He shut his equipment down, made his report that he had shut it down. They came and hauled the equipment away, and he was, never saw the equipment again. This was called part of Project Phoenix. There was, of course, a computer program in Saigon called Project Phoenix. There were a number of other side issues put under that umbrella called Project Phoenix. But that was an example of new electronic hardware I suspect was not even built here. It was alien equipment. But they did test it, and I have an eyewitness report from the guy who ran the equipment.
Is this different than the problem you had of moving the time phase, and you said they didn't solve the problem of the time phase and the location phase until 75, and Vietnam War was over by then. So whatever was its dysfunction in this early period of the early 70s or late 60s in Vietnam was some other technology that accomplished the same thing, unless it's just taking it out of space or someplace to leave them.
That I don't know, and he didn't know. Anything is possible in terms of this. The people were obviously taken out of our current reference, speaking of those years, space-time. Where they were transported to or what happened to them, nobody seems to know.
But we haven't solved the problem of physical, moving the physical location along with the time location until 75, according to what you said earlier. Am I understanding correctly?
Yes, so far as the Phoenix Project was concerned, that's correct. See, and this was done in 65, which was 10 years prior.
Yeah, that was my point.
Which is just the point that you raised, and it's a correct point. This probably was not our equipment. We had a lot of cooperation from aliens at that time, and a lot of new hardware and technology was tried out in Vietnam, right up to the end in 72. There's more stories I could tell, but we don't have time. And many, many things were done in Vietnam in the way of experimental work, from medical to who knows what else. If you have any other questions, I'll try to answer them. Okay, this gentleman here.
Were the aliens working with the North Vietnamese? Since they eventually included
Not working with them. We do know that there was another interesting point you raised there. We do know that there was a covert program involving aliens going on, and the U.S. government knew that the aliens were involved in the war in the sense that they were going behind the lines and picking up soldiers, raiding villages. And every time they had a report like this, they would say that the VC helicopters were busy behind the lines. They had no helicopters. This was a code word saying this was alien operations. We even had a B-52 bomber that came down in the jungle intact, set down directly with landing gear still up in the wings, undamaged. The whole crew was dead. They had been totally drained of blood. And I know the person who went in and part of the investigative crew of this, and he didn't know what was going on until much later, that it was alien. And they had picked up bogies on the radar from the ground stations, and they warned actually the captain saw them, and they picked them up on the radar, and they tried evasive maneuvers, and that was the last they ever heard of them. And about 6 months later, the report came out of the B-52 in the jungle. And they went in, they took the dog tags, and there was nothing they could do about the victims. So they took ID in the dog tags and were told to destroy the aircraft. So they did, they destroyed it. Well, that's just one of the little side issues. Yes, there was alien operations in the Vietnam War, but they weren't particularly taking sides one way or the other. They were doing their own thing, whatever that may have been. Yes, you have a question.
For a year and a half, there's been a spate of reappearing survivors from the Titanic. Could this be related to the Phoenix type work?
Don't really know. I know what you're talking of because I've seen the reports. Very strange aspects are involved here, including Nazi submarines turning up in 1992 off the coast of Virginia with calendars dating 1942 on board with fresh Nazi uniforms and pictures of their leader, namely Adolf Hitler, and the walls and all this sort of thing, and they thought it was still 1942 with the war on. It might have been one of the German subs involved in experiments of their own variety of time displacement for invisibility, which went wrong because all the German subs involved in this program disappeared and were never seen again. There was no definitive report other than the Navy captured this submarine and took it in. And what happened after that, there's no reports. Many possibilities exist. Now you also have to understand that some of these time portals, as they are called, are natural. They're a natural phenomenon on Earth where this sort of thing occurs. And there's also, of course, the work that's been done artificially. So which was it? We don't know. Yes, you have a question.
Yeah, I've actually seen a painting of the Titanic with alien craft around it during the time that they were shooting off the flares. They were contacted by aliens, as far as I know.
You have seen pictures of this?
I've seen a painting that was done from photographs.
Oh,
It was
okay.
at a gentleman's house who we've talked about before. A guy
Yeah.
who's really heavily involved. I want to know, did the Psycho group ever find the cave group, the aliens you call the cave group?
I don't know the answer to that. I presume they may have, but I don't know. They kept the psychic group going because it was successful in its operations. I presume was successful in that first initial endeavor. But it certainly was successful in a lot of other things after that, so they kept it going and have kept it going to this day. NASA has their own group. The White House has a special select group, and there are other groups around, probably running within the Air Force and the Army, but I don't know that as a fact. The original one is still operational administratively, but most of the members walked out on them back in a particular incident involved in 1991, March. Won't go into that, it's too involved.
Do you know what the symbol on the Syrian alien that you showed, the snake, with the, looked like a winged serpent, what
Yes.
that was all about? What did that signify to them?
I don't know. There are probably people who could tell me, like Harleybird, Dr. Harleybird, because he spent 7 years in the Pentagon working with alien language codices and decoding of various things. He might well understand. I've never asked him that one, but I do not know myself. Any other questions? Yes, you.
How did you impress them regain your memory?
How? In terms of the Phoenix Project, it was because I made 2 visits out to the old Montauk site, and they were so heavily restimulative. The one visit didn't do it. For the second visit, which was in May of '86, when most of those pictures were taken, the earlier ones, because of that visit, I started to recover my memories. Preston and Duncan had many visits in between that period because they lived in the area, and they had long since recovered their memories, at least in part, of the fact that they were involved in the project and kept insisting I was part of it. Eventually I found out I was.
So it all came back spontaneously.
Essentially, yes, with the proper external stimuli, like visiting the scene of the crime, if you will. Yes.
Anyway, the alien group that worked on the Montauk Project, would you suppose that they are still at work with the government?
Oh, definitely. Very definitely. Many of them are still at work with the government, though the who's on whose side has shifted quite a bit. Yes, your other
You
question.
were talking about the natural time forms that existed throughout the Earth. Is that anything to do with the, 5 or 6 equidistant space, Bermuda-type triangles throughout the planet?
It's interrelated in terms of the natural phenomena. The Bermuda Triangle is one of the 12 such vortices that exist. There are other vortices, dimensional doorways, if you want to call them that, which exist throughout the planet. I understand the government has full charts of them, yet I hear reports they don't. I think it's cover-up. But in any case, there is understanding of this in various levels, and they do have a strange period. The natural ones have a strange periodicity. X number of days or hours after the full moon and the new moon is when the doorway will be open. It'll be at the full moon or new moon if you're on the equator, and as you go north towards either the Arctic or the Antarctic Circle, the period of delay goes up to 1 day and on through to 5 days at the Arctic Circle or the Antarctic Circle, when the doorway will open for about 12 hours.
Any relation between that and the Sargasso Sea?
I'm sorry, on the what?
Any relation between that and all the ships and the
Sargasso Sea. No, the Sargasso Sea, as far as I know, is not related to the Bermuda Triangle. It's partially in the same area, but the Bermuda Triangle function has been argued for years. Is it a natural function or is it an artificial function? Because there are those who insist that in that area there's an ancient Atlantean city with a pyramid and a crystal on the top. Well, there are those who claim this. I cannot say yes or no. I don't know. But definitely the phenomena exists. The Bermuda Triangle is well recorded for some 200 years by Lloyd's of London. It's the most active one on the planet. The next most active one is the one off of the east coast of Japan in the Japanese Sea.
What the Japanese call the Devil Sea?
Yes. Second most active. All but 2 are in the ocean. There's one in dry land at Afghanistan, and there's another one, of course, down in Antarctica. Don't really know. The Nazi base was established by Admiral Alfred Richter in 1938 and 39 from their explorations. And it's still marked out very clearly on the National Geographic World Atlas. And it encompassed some 600,000 square kilometers of land. And it's off in the, if you want to call it, because anything past the South Pole is north. But in the northern section of the Antarctic continent, which is near the southern tip of South America, is where that section is where the Nazis claimed their land. This includes the warm water lakes, the mountains clear of ice and snow, and where there is some apparent greenery and shrubbery growing, according to some of the reports. It's well documented by the Navy. There is even a movie out, which was produced in 1948, showing this Admiral Byrd's expedition in 47. They sanitized it, not to show his real reason for going, but they did show in documentary a lot of these areas. Very high mountains and the warm water lakes.
You said earlier you quit the project because of dirty, nasty things they had done. You said you'd go into that later.
Oh.
The Montauk Project and the time tunnel and all that.
And what was that?
You said earlier, well, I quit the project because of some dirty, nasty things they did.
I didn't quit the project, no. There was one man who was thrown out. The project was sabotaged because of partly the boys program and some other things. And Duncan, at one point, was a very arrogant type person himself, acted like he was king of the hill, and someplace along the line he got religion, to use that expression. We don't know if that's really what happened to him. He suddenly became meek and mild and wanted to end the project. And various people joined with him in that endeavor, and it was concluded successfully. Okay, any other questions? This gentleman here.
I'm a little bit of a disadvantage today. I didn't hear you lecture this morning.
Okay. The videotape will eventually be available of it.
Do you have publications and so forth? Or, have you published anything?
No, other than the videos, I do not. In terms of the Montauk Project, there is a bulletin or magazine now being published in Long Island entitled the Montauk Pulse, which started up this spring. It'll be a quarterly, giving some of the background current information on Montauk and what's going on there. And you can get that by contacting Peter Moon at the address which is given on the book. The book, The Montauk Project, outlines a lot of what I've given tonight, but not all of it. There's a lot of it is not in there because it's going to be a series of books. The second one will be the Legends of Montauk, showing the family connections and the interlocking relationships of family people and what we did not ever think in the beginning were family relations, but apparently are. So that will be a second book. There will be one on the politics of Montauk. There will be another one done by Preston at a later date on the hard science of Montauk, which will probably be a most interesting book.
The bottom line question I have is that if what you're saying is accurate, I mean, we're totally through the looking glass, all bets are off, all this crap with quibbling Machiavellian nation states is totally irrelevant.
It is irrelevant, and it is also manufactured as a distraction to the general world populations to keep their minds and eyes off of what is really going on.
Right, and we and you and anyone else could be just dangling on alien-held puppet strings.
Yeah, it's the agreement was.
The memories that you recovered may or may not be memories of things that really happened.
Well, there's too many other people who have the same data and the same details. So it's not a singular memory.
Discussing it doesn't seem beyond conception that this alien technology could induce mass memories of anything.
There are ways of checking on that. Theoretically, it could induce mass memories of various things. Yes, Jung himself said that. The mass human subconscious can do various things and create scenarios because of the subconscious memories. There are ways of checking on that. There are ways of cross-checking in terms of history, in terms of changes of history, in terms of leakage from inside the government in the last 5 years, roughly, of people who bailed out.
But you don't have a sense of the ultimate outcome of all this, or what it's about?
Yes, the techniques and the technology was developed for scientific exploration in many respects, but also in developing the time techniques, the purpose was to change history, to be what the ruling elite on this planet, the black nobility and those in Europe who want to have a one-world government, a new world order, if you will. They want history to come out in a certain way in terms of what they want for their control and for their interests, regardless of what might be a normal development. They have been manipulating history. To how much extent we don't know. Only those who do the manipulating know. But there has been this aspect, and that you're correct. We don't really know, in many respects, where we're at. Okay, question in the back.
Al, with this August being the 10-year node mark since 1983, are you expecting anything to personally happen to you as far as...
I'm not expecting anything to happen, but I don't know what might possibly happen. I'm not terribly concerned about it, but at the same time, I am to some extent. I think if I were at Montauk during that, let's say, the 2-day period around the 12th of August, 93, Preston Nichols intends to be there, and Duncan intends to be there. I don't know whether I will be or not. And they're ready and waiting to see what happens, very frankly.
What will happen to Junior and all those people?
Junior will probably remain there. Junior will probably remain there. He's been there since 83, but we don't know for sure.
Or will he activate in 90 this year or August?
It requires a full functioning transmitter which would be locked in to that reality of what Junior was in order to reactivate them, and I don't think there's any reason to do that, and I don't think anybody would want to do it. I would say no, it's not possible to repair it. It's done. It happened. And it created problems in other realities also, other space-time universes. And just as a matter of healing over a period of 20 years. And there's no way of, shall we say, closing it and making it like it never happened. To my knowledge, there's no way of doing that.
But it will be?
Yes, in the year 2003.
You're talking about the frequency control. What can an individual do to counter those?
The average individual can't do very much. One of the problems is that this type of control, what you're referring to, this type of control is aimed at the mass populations in the big cities to keep them under control, keep them docile in case of riots, or create riots for the purpose of inducing a condition whereby they can declare martial law and move FEMA in. And this is one of the goals, is to create a scenario where they can declare martial law nationwide in order to have total control. They have to show a reason, an excuse. And it has to be logical or enough people will revolt. So if you want everybody to accept it, they have to show that there have been these kind of riots over major cities throughout the U.S. Whether they're artificially generated or not is immaterial. If they have them, they got to stop them. And of course, if you remember the L.A. riots of a year ago, well, it wasn't restricted to Los Angeles. There were about 6 or 8 cities in the U.S. where the same thing, to a greater or lesser degree, occurred. They were artificially induced, and for the purpose of getting the minds of the population and ready for something like national control, FEMA, or whatever. It was not used, but the scenario was established that they can have this kind of controlled rioting, regardless of how it was done.